All right. Well, welcome everybody to the afternoon session of Astronosis 2. I hope you are all filled with your illusionary food and illusionary caffeine. But this is real because it's always great when I can interact and hear the gnosis of my friend and a researcher who I admire the most, a mutual Crypto Kiss fan. Yes, we are Crypto Kiss fans. There's no logic to it, but that's where the fun begins. So I'm not going to spend more time. Please, Mitch, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. I haven't been back on the Theosophical Society campus since before the COVID lockdown, and it's amazing how time does pass. There is one thing that I want to mention. I wasn't asked to talk about this, and I'm not a product pitchman, but I do want to suggest to you that those of you who are not members of the Theosophical Society should consider joining. If you really want to piss off the Archons, which I think is a noble goal for everyone in this room, this is a member-supported society, and spaces and campuses like this one are supported to a very great extent by members. You heard earlier from Richard Smoley, who, among other things, has been the editor for 15 years of Quest magazine, which is published by the TSA. I've often said it's the finest general interest spiritual magazine in this country. So you get Quest, you get to maintain beautiful spaces like this, and you get to help foster the exchange, which is what we're doing this weekend. When I was first invited to the conference, I enjoyed Miguel Conner's title, Meet the Archons, because it raises the question of who the Archons are. I keep reading the title and thinking to myself, maybe I'm the Archons. Maybe other guests here are the Archons. I wasn't quite sure what it was Miguel was driving at with that title. And so I'm going to speak today about materialist opposition to our understanding of the extraphysical. But I hope that as I'm exploring that topic with you, I'll also take some time to consider whether, in fact, I am aping some of the very suppressive behaviors that I'm going to speak to you about, because I think one way of confronting the Archons, in fact, one way that we must confront the Archons are for scrutinizing ourselves for some of the traits that we're identifying. It behooves us as seekers to do so. Over the past several years, I've personally developed a very, very deep interest in psychological research, which is to say lab-based research for ESP, precognition, remote viewing, clairvoyance. This research organized in a scientific manner. And when I say scientific, I just mean methodological replication. We have a bad habit in our society of referring to science almost like materialist tablets handed down from Mount Sinai, as if the instant you say the word science, you have somehow claimed the mantle of authority. But again, this is a kind of cultural conditioning that we get into that shuts down our capacity to reason with one another. Science is nothing other than methodological replication. So that's what I'm speaking of when I speak in those terms. Almost for 100 years or so in our society, in the Western world, we have had a very expertly crafted parapsychological culture, edifice, system. Parapsychology is the effort to apply the scientific method to probing questions of the extraphysical. And the research and the data that has emerged from that past century of psychical research has just absolutely been extraordinary. One of the raps on it, which you can find frequently on Wikipedia, among other places, is that it's never been replicated, there are methodological flaws, and so on and so forth. That information is almost all of a deeply suppressive polemical nature, much of it emerging from the same source, There's a publisher in Buffalo, New York, not quite as large as it used to be, but still quite formidable, ironically called Prometheus Books. And they publish various magazines, newsletters, books, largely by the same coterie of people, and probably a smaller circle than those of us in this room, that again and again recycle old, frequently debunked criticisms of psychical research, which are easily countered by anybody who knows the data. Because the simple fact is, and I will argue for this over the course of this brief talk, we possess vast amounts of high quality, heavily juried, meta-analyzed, and replicable data telling us that there is an extra physical capacity to the psyche. We are not just beings of flesh and bone whose every act is either motor skill or cognition, almost like bubbles in a glass of carbonated water. And when the water or our bodies are gone, everything is gone. That's the materialist point of view. The strict materialist point of view is that matter creates itself, intellect or psyche. When I say psyche, I mean a compact of thought and emotion, is strictly an epiphenomenon of the brain or the glass of water. And when the glass of water is gone, the bubbles are gone, and there's nothing else to life. We know that to be absolutely false. Materialism as a philosophy, again, the philosophy that matter creates itself, is defunct in the 21st century. It simply no longer covers the basis of life. And one doesn't need to go very far into psychical research or any controversial data to prove that. That can be proven, for example, on the most elementary scale by looking at a field of clinical psychology that is accepted across our culture today, known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, which is a fairly young field, demonstrates very simply that control-directed thoughts ultimately, and doesn't take very long actually, control-directed thoughts over a period of weeks will alter the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in your brain. And the founder of the field, who's still very much with us, Jeffrey M. Schwartz, who's a psychiatrist at UCLA, very bravely and correctly states that what we are seeing literally is mind over matter. Literally mind over matter. We're seeing something called a thought, which we really can't even as a society define, even as we go barreling towards something called artificial intelligence. There's no consensus definition of what is intelligence, what is awareness, what is a thought. I once asked the philosopher Jacob Needleman, how would you define consciousness? And he responded to me, I wouldn't. And I appreciated that response. Not because he was being glib, but because it recognizes the fact that there's no consensus definition around any of this. We know more about outer space than we do about the actual origination of our thoughts. Again, even as we go barreling towards something called artificial intelligence. And we all feel this sense of unease about artificial intelligence, right? You know, we've watched all these prescient science fiction movies and such that are going to tell us it's going to come after us, all of which are reasonable concerns. We're worried about being replaced in our employment by AI. Very, very reasonable concern. But I think one of the unspoken reasons that we all feel an appropriate sense of anxiety about AI is that we're using terms we haven't even defined. So if you bank on the materialist definition, intelligence is nothing but calculation that grows out of this mainframe or hard drive called the brain. Well, it doesn't hold up because even a field like neuroplasticity, whose data is challenged by exactly no one, there's nothing controversial about it, which is why I dote on it. Even that field by itself provides us a core sample demonstrating that we don't know what intelligence is because it's something that is actually affecting the matter that is supposed to be giving rise to it. Dig that. It's affecting the matter that is supposedly giving rise to it. It totally upends the materialist concept of life. I'm not even getting into quantum theory, string theory, psychical research, mind-body questions, all of which are fascinating, and some of which I'll briefly touch on. But just at the base of the matter, materialism as a philosophy has failed. And yet, we live in such interesting times because you can succeed intellectually and lose culturally. And the seeking culture, and certainly that aspect of the seeking culture that focuses on parapsychology, has lost culturally. We have no dominance in reference media. We have no dominance in academia. We have no dominance in news media. And if you visit the world's go-to reference source, Wikipedia, every claim that I'm going to make will be multiply footnoted, most of it to sources emerging from this publishing house, Prometheus, as being wrong, as being incorrect. And there's no court of appeals. There's no one to go to. The crowdsourcing on Wikipedia has run riot over any topics touching on parapsychology to the extent that it's an impenetrable box. We've lost. And yet I'm in a good mood because intellectually we've won. The data is absolutely bulletproof, replicable, and despite the best efforts of the Archons of Materialism, it just keeps on coming. I'm going to give you a very specific example of that. In 2011, a very prominent clinical psychologist at Cornell University named Daryl Bem published a paper called Feeling the Future. And Bem's paper resulted from a decade of study into precognition. And Bem structured a series of 9 experiments, each of these involving thousands of subjects. And in Bem's first 7 experiments, he very ably and very capably replicated some work that had already been done in the field, which is to say, he did experiments that showed that if you flash before an individual images that are in some way emotionally arousing, that individual will demonstrate bodily stressors just a few seconds prior to being shown the image, if you statistically crunch down the numbers. Bem's innovation, and I think this was wise, was, and some people make fun of this, but I'll put it to you straight, Bem's innovation was that among these images that he flashed before subjects were included pornographic images. I did say that the psyche is a compact of thought and emotion. So when you're engaged in these things, you do need to have some skin in the game. The great parapsychologist J.B. Rhine, who's a hero to me, observed in the 1930s in his card tests involving Zener cards, a 5-suit deck of cards, testing for ESP, that results seemed to spike if there was a prevailing feeling of comity, hopeful expectancy, enthusiasm, good spirits in the lab. If there was boredom, distraction, indifference, results would invariably drop. You've observed this, I'm sure, in your own experience. If you're studying for something and you're excited about what you're studying, you're obviously going to display greater memory retention, greater enthusiasm. You'll be more resilient in your studies versus the opposite. If you don't care about something, you check out, you're imagining things, you're looking at the window, you're looking at your phone and so forth. So Rhine found that to be a very distinct correlation. And Bem said, well, that being the case, why don't we put some more skin in the game, literally, and use these pornographic images. And he found that he did get better results using images that proved arousing. Anyway, he crunched the numbers expertly, but it was his last 2 experiments 8 and 9, where the rubber really hit the road. And this was absolutely remarkable. Bem found that in matters of precognition, there exists what he called a retrocausal effect, which is to say that things that you may do in the so-called future, and I say so-called because we've known since Einstein, we've known since the theories of relativity, which have since been proven, that time is relative, time is linear, past, present, future. These are very important concepts to help us as 5 sensory beings work our way through life. We need them. If Miguel says, I'm speaking at 2, and I tell him time's not real, so I'm off campus doing something, we have a problem. But they're not ultimate reality. They're a concept of reality. They're a device. They're a conception to help us get through life. We can't be overwhelmed by data. There's only so much data that we can digest and take in. So Bem, operating from that premise, hypothesized that maybe stuff that we do in what we perceive as the future reaches backward in time, so to speak, and affects our performance or our cognition in the so-called present. So he devised a very simple set of tests. It was a word memorization test. He would basically give subjects a list of words, let's say 10 words, and would say to them, memorize these words and recite back to me what you're capable of memorizing, just in a short space of time. So, as might be expected, subjects would review the list, and they might remember 5 or 6 words out of the 10. Then he added a wrinkle. He had the same subjects study the word list again in the future after they had already given their answers. And the results spiked. The results spiked consistently over thousands of trials by 2, sometimes 3 percentage points. Small, but significant, statistically very significant. And it happened again and again and again. And he refined the exercise in series 9. And again, he found over tens of thousands of trials, people would do better when that one additional wrinkle was added. Where, remember, they're not going back and taking the test over. That's not happening. They take the test once. The added wrinkle was that following the test, they study again and scores spiked. This was published, his paper, in a very prominent psychology journal. And the response was absolute outrage in the social sciences and journalism. Calumny was brought down on this man's name. There was an article that ran in the New York Times that reviewed a series of scandals in the social sciences where a lot of major studies were found to have polluted or corrupted data. There was fraud. And the reporter included Bem in his opening paragraph saying, and a major psychology journal published a paper on precognition, without ever once referencing the paper again in the article. And so, I kind of got into my, dear sir, this will not stand, mood. I contacted the editorial ombudsman at the New York Times, a paper for which I have written. She ignored me. That position no longer exists. I wrote a letter to the editor. It did not run. I absolutely could not get a hearing as to why a paper by a prominent clinical psychologist that made, admittedly, a heterodox claim, but again, what is science? Methodological replication. He followed the rules of the road. It's not his fault if you don't like the data. He followed the rules of the road. And it was grouped in with corrupt data without any justification or return to that point in the article. And then along come the Archons of Materialism. The professional skeptics community decided, well, someone needs to do something about this. So a group of 3 professional skeptics put together a replication of some of Bem's trials. He spent 10 years of his life on this alone. 3 people in 1 year popped out a paper with the media-friendly title of Failing the Future. Bem's original was Feeling the Future. Get it? Ha ha. Archons are funny. And they rushed their paper into print and maintained that in having rerun Bem's trials, they found failure. They found no replication, and their results were counter-confirming. And this, too, made headlines. So everybody could just go back to sleep. Relax. This, Dr. Frankenstein out at Cornell, nothing here you need to worry about. Just keep walking. And the results from their supposedly debunking paper were so widespread, so widely reported, and so firmly ensconced in reference literature that I believed them myself, even as somebody who cares very deeply about this material and who is very publicly partial to this material. I too thought to myself, well, Bem's data can't be ranked among core data in the parapsychology field. And I wrote to a friend of mine who some of you probably know, Dean Radin, who is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California. And I said to Dean, and I have the emails, I can show them to you, and I've reproduced them in my book, Daydream Believer. I said to Dean, I get the impression that Daryl Bem's data cannot be accounted among core data of the field because it hasn't been replicated. And Dean, in his very stoic, understated way, wrote back to me, the Bem data is fine. So I thought, okay, I need to go deeper down this rabbit hole. I need to dig more. Now, I was at, I guess, what seemed like a good vantage point, because this was in 2021, so about 10 years have passed since Bem's initial studies were published. So I go digging, and it turns out that not only have Bem's findings been replicated, but in a paper that was updated as recently as July of 2020, Bem's findings were proved confirmatory in a meta-analysis encompassing 90 experiments, including Bem's originals, in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. They were actually confirmed internationally, including in languages other than English. Italian was among the languages. 90 experiments in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. How many meta-analyses of popular pharmaceutical drugs do you think get that level of jury testing? How many? Not many. And I learned something else as well. The trio of skeptics who claim to rerun Bem's data and find it non-confirmatory, at the outset of their experiments, they created an open source database, and they announced as their own rules of the road, anyone else out there in the culture who is replicating these experiments should file your paperwork, your numbers, on our open source database, and we will report the results. They said that as plainly as I'm saying it to you right now. At the time of publication, they had 3 studies that had been submitted to their open source database. 2 out of the 3 were confirmatory of Bem's findings, and they didn't report them, violating their own rules of the road. Bem objected to the researchers and said, hey, you guys violated your own ground rules. You had 2 confirming studies of my work in your open source database, and you didn't report it. And what did they say? They changed the subject. They said, oh yeah? Well, you had non-confirming studies in your own database that you didn't report. And Bem said, well, wait a minute. You're talking about one study, which was an online study that I had problems with, and I spoke to the editor of the journal, and I spoke to the jurors who reviewed my article, and I explained to them why I didn't include that, and they agreed with me. And after that, the conversation just goes off into, talking head nowheresville, because skeptics will use, skeptics in quotation marks, will use just your most baseline, ordinary debate tactics of changing the subject, obfuscating, saying, oh, look over here so you don't see what this hand is doing, rather than just deal dead on with the simple fact that they violated their own rules of the road in non-reportage of confirmatory studies that sat in their own database, which would have more or less abrogated their own numbers if you crunch them all together. I have found violations like this, violations of common ethics of reportage, again and again across the skeptics field. And these are supposed to be people who are protecting the rest of us from irrationalism, from flights of fancy, from woo-woo nonsense. These are the guardians. These are the guardians of logic, disinterest, replication, scientific ethics. This kind of thing goes on again and again and again, ad infinitum. And I'm selecting only one example because it just happens to be the most recent. And as I was wrestling with some of this material in my book, Daydream Believer, where I write about it quite extensively, I found myself using a word that I don't use easily and that I don't use comfortably, and that is suppression of a cultural sort, where material that runs contrary to the physicalist, materialist storyline in our culture, which is what it is at this point. It's a position of sentiment, not data. It's a position of sentiment, not data. Material that runs counter to that is mocked, misrepresented. Its purveyors and researchers are smeared, called horrible names. There's a Cambridge biologist who I'm sure some of you know named Rupert Sheldrake. He's referred to on Wikipedia today as a purveyor of pseudoscience because Rupert has conducted enormously rigorous studies of animal instinct, and he has drawn a correlation between instances of animal instinct, which is just a colloquialism, another colloquialism. What is instinct? What is instinct? Sure, I could muddle my way through a few words and explain what instinct is, but it's sort of like invoking the term synchronicity. We know that the term exists. We know that the term demarcates something real, but it's not exactly a definition so much as it is a placeholder until we arrive at a definition. And those things have their place. We speak in metaphor all the time. I might speak in terms of energies or vibrations. I might mean it literally. I might mean it metaphorically because I'm identifying an occurrence. And we have a place marker until we better understand what an occurrence is. Instinct is one of those words. So Sheldrake decided he was going to do studies to map out the occurrence of instinct in such a way that it made it absolutely incontrovertible that in certain cases, animals seem to have a presentiment or an extrasensory awareness of data that there is no way that we could understand through their five senses that it would come to them. And he has been excoriated for this, absolutely excoriated for this. There are experiments in the parapsychological field called Ganzfeld experiments. Ganzfeld is German for open field, and they were conducted in the 70s and 80s by an extraordinary parapsychologist, Charles Honorton, who died in 1992 at the age of 46. Young guy. He had struggled with health issues his whole life. And I've said that losing Honorton is the equivalent to parapsychology as it would have been to losing Einstein at the dawn of his theories of relativity and time-space. Honorton, in the 70s and 80s, conducted these experiments called the Ganzfeld experiments based on his hypothesis that incidents of ESP, clairvoyance, remote viewing, might spike when we, the subjects, are in conditions of comfortable sensory deprivation. He felt that our circuitry, so to speak, might get overloaded by data, a problem that has to be far more serious today in an age of handheld devices and so on. And so he decided to see whether placing a person into a Depro tank might spike his or her ESP responses. So he would take one subject called a receiver, and he would seat that subject in a situation of comfortable sensory deprivation. So the person might be in a soundproof chamber, relaxing in a lazy boy chair, wearing white noise headphones, wearing eye shades, no sensory data whatsoever, entering a state of very deep relaxation that's often called hypnagogia. It's similar to the state that we enter just as we're drifting to sleep at night, and again, just as we're coming to in the morning. Very comfortable, relaxed state, almost a dreamlike state, but we're still in control of our cognition. So Honorton places subjects, the receivers, into that kind of physical situation. And then there's another subject seated outside the booth known as the sender. The sender is looking at 4 pictures, a boat, a house, a rocket ship, what have you. And the sender is making an effort to project, so to speak, one of the images, one of the 4 images to the person in the booth, the receiver. So of the 4 images, 3 are decoys and 1 is the real deal. So the sender is attempting to convey the real deal to the subject in the booth. Anyway, by guesswork over time, you got a 1 in 4, 25% chance of getting a guess hit correctly. But over thousands of trials, and with the data crunched and pooled, Honorton found again and again that his subjects were getting much, much higher than chance. They were getting 32%, 33%, 35%, much higher than what chance should be showing. And this material, again, was subject to tremendous scrutiny, and something absolutely unprecedented occurred. Honorton partnered with an avowed career skeptic who's still living, named Ray Hyman, who's a professor emeritus of psychology at University of Oregon. Hyman is a hardcore anti-psi, anti-ESP skeptic. But Honorton, who I wish was still with us, was able, for the one and only time that I've ever seen, to break through this wall, and the two of them embarked on a long-term collaboration where they reviewed all the data. They crunched it together. Nothing was withheld. Everything was on the table. Everything was transparent. And they co-authored a paper in which Hyman, the skeptic, conceded that while he still disputed the ESP thesis, he acknowledged that there was no corruption or no pollution in the data, that earlier problems of data collection that he had critiqued had been resolved, and that the data was clinically and mathematically legit, and that more research was required. That's all. No concession of belief in ESP, just that more research was required. That was in 1986. Honorton died 6 years later. That effort has never been repeated. And when the New York Times ran an article on Daryl Bem's precognition experiments, who was quoted at the top of the article but Ray Hyman saying, "It's craziness, pure craziness. It's an embarrassment to the field that this data got published." And I have personally experienced that again and again. People say to me, "Why don't you debate skeptics?" And I say to them, I chase down skeptics like Wyatt Earp used to chase down, stagecoach robbers. I couldn't be more interested in debating skeptics. I can't find skeptics to debate because I will personally challenge them and they play hide and seek with me and they disappear. Moreover, I have, in fact, debated with skeptics in private, across a table, one-on-one. And I will tell you this, and I say this standing here in absolute veracity. They will agree with me. They will say, okay, I concede the point. The data is real. The data stands up. The data is bulletproof. And the next day on social media, they will completely reverse themselves. I could name names, but for the fact that I'm not interested in personally holding anybody up to ridicule because I'm not a skeptic. And I've witnessed it again and again and again. I defended Bem's data of all places, at a conference of tech entrepreneurs in Miami in January of 2022. I guess that was a Meet the Archons conference. And so I met the Archons, and some of them were very nice, and they were all interested in Aleister Crowley, interestingly enough. I had more people that weekend coming up asking me about Crowley than I have across my lifetime. Be that as it may, I spoke in front of the conference, and they were really down for listening. I mean, they were really, really down for listening, and I appreciated it. And sometime later, the clinical psychologist, Steven Pinker, was kind enough to attack me in one of the skeptical magazines. And he said, is Horowitz actually saying, with this precognition, retrocausality stuff, that you can study for an exam, hand in your exam, study afterwards, and improve your grade? And as I've often said, it's a cardinal rule of debating that you're not supposed to accept your interlocutor's premise. It's considered a bad tactic if you respond accepting of your interlocutor's premise, because he or she is always trying to narrow you into a corner. But I'll throw that rule out and respond to Professor Pinker, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. Not in the way that he's trying to frame it, more or less. I'm not saying that if you get a B on your paper and you study afterwards, that B somewhere in your professor's inbox is going to magically change to a B+. No, that's not what Bem tested for. What Bem tested for is that when you take that paper, you will have improved cognition, moderate, but significant, improved cognition based on whenever you study, including the so-called future. You don't like the data? Well, that's the scientific method. Then throw out the scientific method and come up with something else, because that's the data that we've got, and it's been replicated, crunched, repeated, and verified time after time after time, 10 years hence. The great John Mack, who was mentioned earlier, who studied alien abduction testimonies for many, many years at Harvard, got into a lot of trouble for it, said, in effect, look, I'm a trauma specialist. All I'm telling you is, based on every tool available to me and based on every tool available across the field, these people are telling the truth. You don't like it? Go to a different researcher. Go to a skeptic. Go to a different clinician. I'm telling you that based upon the tools that are available to my field at large, these experiencers are telling the truth. That was Mack's contention, for which he was investigated at risk of job, tenure, position, and reputation. And he made a wonderful observation toward the end of his life, another man that we lost far, far too soon. He made a wonderful observation toward the end of his life. He was being interviewed by the consciousness theorist Terence McKenna, who we also lost too soon. This only the good die young. Maybe there's something to it. And McKenna spoke to him, and they finished up their interview, and Max said at the end, there's just one more thing I want to add. And McKenna said, yeah, go ahead. And he said, if you want to disrupt Western civilization, he didn't use the term archons, but I think if he was here this weekend with us, he would have been perfectly happy to. He said, if you want to disrupt these deeply calcified conventional ways of thinking that promulgate the myth that humanity is nothing but flesh and bone, and there's nothing extra physical, nothing interdimensional, no other intersections of time, no other name of the game going on other than just kind of flesh and bone mechanistic activities, standard Newtonian mechanics, leaving aside the fact that Isaac Newton himself was an alchemist, would have been actually very comfortable at the Theosophical Society. You probably couldn't have gotten him out of the building. And he said, if you want to disrupt that, the ultimate sin in Western life is this. This is the ultimate sin in Western life for which you will pay a price, a fearsome price. And it is that we in the West are allowing of the study of spirituality, religion, extraphysicality, whatever term you want to use. We're allowing of it within the structures of theology, poetry, study of myth, stories, fiction, standard religions, will allow for the study of the extraphysical in these different proscribed fields. But the very instant that you suggest that something from the so-called spiritual or extraphysical realm could actually be felt and experienced in our own physicalist realm, you're finished. That's the ultimate sin. You can frame it in terms of history, myth, theology, study of religion, poetry, individual experience, imagination, fine. But the very instant you suggest that there are actually concrete physical encroachments of the extraphysical or interdimensional within our world, you don't fit anymore. You are out. You are out. The fee of entry to mainstream letters, journalism, Wikipedia is disavowal, And yet we have this data that speaks to the falsehood of that validates the extraphysical. Now, one could say, what does it matter? Maybe I'm just bursting through an open door. Seekers since time immemorial, we met some of them this morning, have probed the extraphysical, have experienced the extraphysical. Many of us in this room have had such personal experiences. And wonderful friend and colleague, Jeff Kreipel, colleague to many in this room, including April DeConnick, dear friend, he very lovingly criticized me, as friends should. And he said, look, you are too attached to Western empiricism. You're too attached to the laboratory model. He doesn't remember saying this to me, but he did say it. He said, you got to spend less time in the German lab and more time in the Irish woods. Doesn't that sound like Jeff? Yeah. So, and he has a good point. He was really saying, look, the lab data is real. I'm down with everything that you're saying. But the fact is, you will find better, more dramatic, more remarkable examples out in the wild, out in the field, than you will in the laboratory. Why are you so obsessed with, 2.5 percentage points on a precog exam when I can introduce you to a faculty member at damn near any university you like who can tell you a story about having a precognitive dream about her child being in danger, and it's true. He said, so you're too attached to this stuff. And Lawrence Lashan, a parapsychologist who died at age 100 on November 9th, 2020, Lawrence made the same argument to me. He said, look, I'm damn near a century old, and I've been studying parapsychology in the lab my whole life. And you're right. But the fact is, we've gone as far as we can go. We need a different model. Don't get overly attached to building, the best raft in the Pacific Fleet. We have to move beyond rafts at a certain point. And he's right. He's right. And yet, I have this impression. First of all, as far as the laboratory model being exhausted with respect to parapsychology, I'm not so sure, because I really do feel, and I'm sure that the enthusiasm with which I speak about it gives this away, I really do feel that Daryl Bem's experiments were just extraordinary. And the price that this man paid, the price that this man paid professionally and personally is one that I don't know if I could take on my own shoulders. But he did take it on his shoulders, and his data has stood up so remarkably. And I think it's remarkable and it's important not only because it exposes us to reality, but it actually exposes us to application. It actually gives us something we could try. It gives us something we could experiment with. Several months ago, a Muay Thai or Thai kickboxing fighter named Spencer Hanley approached me. And Spencer Hanley, you can find his fights on YouTube. I don't know how many of you are Thai kickboxing fans, but I recommend them. And Spencer said, I'm 9 days away from a match. I feel good about my training. but I'm wondering if you can recommend anything that'll help me with my mental game. And I suggested to him an exercise that I often prescribe called the 30-day mental challenge. It's a very simple exercise in which you contract with yourself to just direct your thoughts toward that which is productive and advancing. And he said, well, listen, fine, I'm going to do it. But as I said, the match is 9 days away. Do you have anything that will help me in the short term? And I said to him, Spencer, and I walked him through all the Bem data, this will help you in the short term. And I can guarantee that your opponent's coaching team are not discussing retrocausality with him. This is going to be a magic arrow in your quiver that just belongs to you. So just try it, because there's no reason to think that your training, whether cognitive or athletic, is strictly bound by our linear sense of time, and we have evidence to the contrary. He did try it. He did win the match. He may very well have won anyway, but he was quite happy. And his entry music, instead of being this like ear-bleeding hip-hop or heavy metal music, was the Belinda Carlisle song, Heaven is a Place on Earth. And one of the announcers said, the fact that he's coming out to Belinda Carlisle makes me so happy. And he just seemed totally relaxed and at ease, and he won. I'm not saying that's a case in point of anything other than the fact that Bem's data is not only remarkable, but in my estimation, it's also applicable. So that's one reason why I remain attached to this material. But there's another reason as well. And I feel very strongly about this. Richard Smalley this morning quoted William Blake to the effect that if we could cleanse the doors of perception, if man could cleanse the doors of perception, he would discover himself as he really is, infinite. And what does it really mean to cleanse the doors of perception? We all hear things like this. It's kind of like, know thyself. Yeah, I agree with that. Right on. And what does it really mean? My feeling is that if the individual has the warranted belief that he or she does possess an extra-physical dimension, does participate in an extra-physical form of life, that understanding, that very legitimate, informed, and warranted understanding could in itself open vistas that we as a human community have not yet probed. And it seems to me that all of the religions of humanity, extending from antiquity, the experience of the Gnostics, up through things that we commonly do today, we get very wrapped up, and understandably so, in ritual, liturgy, hymn, ceremony, image, symbol. I mean, we see some of it in this room. We have the symbology, and it's very, very aesthetically beautiful, and it's important, and it's part of the mosaic of the human story. But I have wondered if we actually have warranted self-belief in the infinitude of our own psyches, by which I mean the capacity of the psyche to receive information through different intersections of time in what might be called an interdimensional way, to participate in aspects of life that exceed the physical. Might that warranted knowledge in and of itself open up vistas and opportunities to us that expand our sense of self-agency, sense of self, the largeness of our conception. The largeness of our conception could grow. And we might not need to rely quite as much on some of the, liturgy, rite, ritual, ceremony that characterizes almost every spiritual practice and pursuit. You look at Aleister Crowley, for example, troubling but brilliant man, a genius, I think. And yet, when you get into Crowley's material, I at times, maybe this has something to do with my Orthodox Jewish upbringing, which I moved away from, I at times start to see this replicating in Crowley and the denseness of the rituals and so forth. I say to myself, I feel like I'm yearning for a drink of water called simplicity. And I certainly can't imagine that I'm alone in that experience. We all have our own tastes, and that's fine. But I have come to wonder whether having a real fixed warranty in the reality, and it is a reality, of the extra-physical dimension to life opens up doors and vistas to us that might free us from some of the trappings of rite, ritual, liturgy, ceremony from antiquity up through the present. And I mentioned in J.B. Ryan's Zener card experiments, he found that a sense of hopeful expectancy, enthusiasm, comity, a belief in the possibility of ESP, that seemed to coincide with a spike in scores. Now, the same thing has been found in the field of placebo studies, which really didn't come into its own until after World War II, a couple of decades after J.B. began his experiments at Duke University. The trigger for a therapeutic response in placebo studies is hopeful expectancy. And teams of clinicians at Harvard Medical School, which is doing some really good work right now in placebo studies, they found in a 2010 transparent placebo study that the placebo response could be engendered in individuals. In this case, the subjects were sufferers from irritable bowel syndrome. The placebo response could be very significantly engendered in a transparent atmosphere. In other words, the subjects are being told, in effect, you're being given a sugar pill. This is an inert substance. We are testing for your response to this inert substance, and the results of sustained and lasting relief were very, very high compared to the control group. I think the results were something on the scale of 37% compared to the control group in single numerals. Statistically, very, very, very significant. And there was no benign deception involved. The researchers, to their credit, were very hesitant to interpret their results. They were trying to be very, very conservative about their results. But I think it's a fair supposition to say that the placebo effect is so widely known among people, it's a household term, that the participants in the study probably went into the study with a more or less reasonable and warranted validation that, yes, there is something called a placebo effect, and yes, I understand it works. I read an article about it in Reader's Digest or what have you, and yeah, I get it. I mean, they had coordinates, and it worked. It worked in terms of the therapeutic response. So if this data breaks through to the public, look, it could help some people arrive at, a wholly warranted and informed conclusion that there is a trackable, replicable, clinically mappable extra-physical component to life. And what we're calling the Archons of Materialism appear to be doing everything possible to keep that realization from occurring, to keep us from looking through Galileo's telescope, from circling the world, from doing whatever it is humanity has done over the course of millennia to glean greater and more information about reality. Now, I'm not sure. I reach the limits of my understanding of human nature sometimes in terms of some of the skeptics' tactics, some of which I've touched on briefly. I have trouble sometimes understanding what motivates them. The closest that I've come is through John Mack's observation that the ultimate sin is demonstration of extra physicality in the actual physical world that we occupy. I think that if I could venture as much sympathy towards them as I'm capable of, I suppose we all defend a world in which we feel safe. Safety is a very, very important issue to human beings. It's hard baked into us. And I suppose that their sense of safety is compromised by some of this data. They feel that there's going to be some wave of irrationality unleashed upon the world, as opposed to all the splendors that we currently have, if this data is validated. And I understand that fear, because I feel that fear too, and I get triggered. And I am trying, frankly, to do a better job personally of being open to data or ideas that sometimes frightens me or unsettles me. I get very worried about the different forms, I suppose, that human persecution takes. And if I hear something that suggests to me that somebody's getting a finger pointed at them or is getting blamed, I can get very emotional and obstinate. And if I've done that to anybody in this room, I apologize. I'm working on that. And I think that the skeptics, I think that they suffer from that, but with the wind in their sails of feeling so right that they never look at themselves in any such way as though to ask, how can unethical or emotionally inappropriate or fundamentalist lines of thought, by fundamentalist, I simply mean the thought paradigm that says, I'm right, you're wrong. How can those things ever bring us in the direction of intellectual or psychical advancement? How possibly could a good garden grow through those kinds of methods? And the orthodox mindset, the absolutist mindset that prevails among the skeptics, is one that I find that they're prone never to look at. And I am not down with throwing around psychological language. I think there are certain terms in our society, narcissist is one of them, that just get overused and get thrown around. But I have come to wonder very recently whether some of these so-called skeptics are people who are suffering from internet addictions, who are suffering from very poor emotional regulation, who in some cases are perhaps suffering from personality disorders that are concealed behind skepticism in quotation marks. I can only offer that as a supposition. It certainly doesn't solve anything. But I suspect that there is at the back of some of these counter efforts a tremendous, tremendous feeling of rightness, a tremendous feeling of contest and the wish to prevail, and a lack of graduated thinking that makes it impossible for them to drink from any well waters unless there is absolute agreement. Hence, since 1986, we've never seen an effort like the Charles Honorton, Ray Hyman joint paper repeat. I hold out no hope whatsoever for any of this changing on Wikipedia, in the academy, in journalism anytime soon. But I would venture that there is reason to feel a sense of morale. And I feel a sense of morale, not because on a cultural scale, the seeking community is going to break through anytime soon in these institutions, although there have been breakthroughs in academia thanks to the efforts of April and Jeff and others. But with respect to some of the organs of opinion, I don't think there's going to be a breakthrough anytime soon. And yet I'm suffused with morale because we are in this peculiar situation, which I referenced earlier, which is that, if I may frame it in these terms, culturally, we've lost. Intellectually, we're heads and shoulders above. We're heads and shoulders above. William Blake made the observation, opposition is true friendship. It's really worth living with that statement. Because of the opposition that we've had to face, and because of the terrible calumny that people like Bem and others have had to take on their shoulders, we have refined our work. We have refined our work, sometimes in small settings, sometimes in moderate-sized gatherings like this one, but refined it no less. And truth has a way of enduring. Truth has a way of surviving. Truth has a way of breaking free. And I think as this truth permeates in our culture, however slowly, it gives people a greater sense of their true selves, which is infinite. And thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Couple of questions from the audience. All right.
Mitch, one thing that I wanted to talk about with these skeptics, and it's something that doesn't usually get addressed, is the fact that so many of them come out of the national security state. You mentioned Ray Hyman, who was involved with the Department of Defense. Andrew Horowitz said that James Randi was on a retainer with the Department of Defense. One of the things, when I was out at Esalen, I talked to Russell Targ and to Ed May. And Ed May came, loaded for bear with this whole body of data. And he's like, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. If you're dealing with something like remote viewing, that's just one example, which the government funded for 25 years. These kind of powers that you're talking about, since they're so poorly understood, if they were to be weaponized, there would be very little defense against them. So what I'm saying is that when you get this kind of opposition, I think there's not only that kind of fear and that kind of narcissism that you see on the part of people who fancy themselves rationalists, but I also think because this discussion comes from the top, right, and it comes from the national security state, that I think that, I'm just trying to tell, I don't even know if I have a question, but I'm just trying to say that, I understand your frustration, but I'm just trying to tell you that I think that there is another agenda at work, and I'm just wondering if that's something that you've thought about or addressed.
I appreciate that, and I have to be open to that. I have thought about it. I had a conversation with Dean Radin about it at Esalen, actually, and he and I are of pretty much the same mind as to this problem, and one of us raised that very question. And I think, in that discussion, which I don't think he would mind my sharing, we both just came away with the attitude that it's possible. We just didn't have enough data, to draw a conclusion. Parapsychologists have obviously received money from the Department of Defense, Ed May being one of them, and the Stargate guys and so forth who you've mentioned. So there is money flowing out there to both, if I can put it that way. As far as the defense application, one of the issues with Psi has always been the question of application. What do you use it for? Which is a big Western sort of question. How can we monetize it? Or how can we use it to defeat them? And it's one of many different laws and forces that we live under. There's a lot of stuff going on within this aquarium that we're in. And so sometimes Psi will break through, sometimes it won't break through. It's not, in my estimation, it's real, but it's not always as reliable as turning on the faucet or dentistry or something like that. So the applications, defense and otherwise, are tricky. As it was explained to me, the Russians will use, they still use Psi as part of their warfare effort, and they might pool a remote viewers report with 4 other intelligence reports they get and say, well, look, are we getting 3 out of 5 hits here? If one of them is Psi, we accept it. But there's a kind of pooling of things, and that's probably how Psi would work in terms of military application. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I don't know. There's such irrationality on the part of the professional skeptics that if there were some centrifugal reason for it, it would certainly make everything a lot simpler. I just don't know. It's one question, I suppose, on the table. Yeah.
All right.
I was just going to say, your example about the test taking and the studying after it to prove the grade, that was interesting to me. I was wondering if there might be any parallels to the kind of like hidden histories that that we're kind of uncovering now through either internet or hidden books and stuff, whereas it ends up kind of rewriting everything just by studying it later and kind of rewriting history, like a sort of time travel just by gnosis.
Right.
Do you think it's something similar to that, or is it?
Well, it's certainly, you mean we may revisit this data later and say, oh my God, this is what we were living through and we didn't understand it?
Just like, what things represented in the past, you're just like,
oh, I see.
Like books that we've uncovered and it's
Sure.
like, oh yeah, we've been living wrong for 2,000 years and doing it this way.
Yeah,
now we
yeah.
know what to do.
Well, this is a supposition. One of the things I suggest in Daydream Believer is that, look, there's no physical model that we presently possess that prohibits the possibility that we could be experiencing this at every instance of existence, including a sense of our own past, present, future. If somebody asked me, where are you from? Well, I'm from Queens. Mom did this, dad did this. Maybe I'm just, gleaning that right now because that's my absolute measurement. That's my perception. That's my emotionalized conviction. And maybe I'm actualizing that in memory as well as in experience. Maybe I'm selecting that from among literally an infinitude of possibilities, and that it's just going on constantly. We have absolutely nothing in any of our physical models or concepts or evidence base that prohibits that. And we have certain things that actually are suggestive of it. So I think that Bem perhaps managed to take a clinical photograph of one very important thing that tells us what's going on in an infinitude of ways in our lives that we have not digested. Yeah, sure. There was somebody, oh, sorry.
So I recently just got this book that was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle about the coming of the fairies.
Yes.
Okay, so you're aware of it.
Oh, very aware of it, yeah.
So when you were talking about skeptics, I was just thinking about this book, where he's just addressing skeptics and working with the theosophical member.
Could you hold up the cover? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's
okay. So it has some of the pictures.
reprint.
So Arthur Conan Doyle, the great author of Sherlock Holmes, was a big advocate of psychical research, a spiritualist, and to his embarrassment in the early 20th, I'll revise that. In the early 20th century, he published a book called The Coming of the Fairies, where these two young girls in the British countryside persuaded him that they had encountered fairies, and they had photographs that later turned out to be cutouts from Parisian fashion magazines. And so not a great day for parapsychology. And I'll be curious, and I'd like to get your impression when you read the book. And I have to be a little more gentle towards Doyle because I read the book years ago, and I came away with the impression, and I'll be very curious to hear your take on it. And my email is at my website. It's easy to find. I thought perhaps Doyle was being a little more tongue-in-cheek than people had given him credit for. There's not a holy roller tone in the book. Again, it's not considered one of the great moments in parapsychology research, but I thought he was being a little more playful than his critics have given him credit for, and that maybe I've given him credit for.
Sherlock, the smartest,
Right.
And if he got duped or, if he's
Yeah. But, and there's also arguments among parapsychologists. J.B. Ryan and Doyle were always at loggerheads. There were splits between the Society of Psychical Research in Britain and in America. Of course, that's what we do as human beings. What do? We form into groups of mutual interest, and then we split from one another. So there are arguments. But I think Doyle, and I will go back to the book, was being a little more playful than maybe his critics have allowed.